Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much, Taylor, for such a lovely introduction. I want to start with some reflections on the theme of this symposium, Befriending Wilderness. A very short meditation before I launch into something a bit broader or a bit narrower, depending on how we look at it. This notion of befriending wilderness. Wilderness, of course, is a highly multivalent term. Geographically speaking, wilderness might be desert or swamp. It might be tundra or deep forest, mountainous or deep underwater, and at any latitude from the equator to the polar extremes. The term might conjure images that are of the utterly desolate or of the overgrown places where nature runs its course, so to speak. And what seems to join such widely diverse regions is their appearance or our experience of them as being inconducive to one's own flourishing, at least in a kind of extended way. Without some kind of extensive alteration either to the place or to myself, within oneself. And this gives wilderness various metaphorical vectors that we're interested in here today and discussing today. Identifying situations in which one is or could imagine oneself to be lost, deeply unsettled, not at home, restless, living with some kind of heightened level of precarity and vulnerability of one sort or another. And such situations might be genuinely dangerous and disorienting. They might be places of exile or purposelessness, marked by perhaps isolation, disconnection, undernourishment, pain, regret, fear. But these same situations might also be liberating, cleansing, reorienting, transformative. When the desert fathers and mothers went into the desert, for instance, or into the forests, they did so specifically to quiet themselves and to quiet their own chattering idolatries. And that's, I think, a deeply important aspect of wilderness and finding oneself in wilderness. There are lots of different kinds of wilderness in one's life. But wilderness tends to draw into view one's own predisposition toward controllability. As I've been thinking more about this weekend, I've had Hartmut Rosa in mind, if any of you know his work, author of a big book called Resonance, which he also distills into a shorter book called The Uncontrollability of the World. And wilderness experiences, however we define that or imagine that, tend to draw into view my own predisposition, I'll speak in first person, toward controllability, which is not just a desire to control things, but it's a disposition that things are controllable. If you understand them well enough, have enough insight, apply good enough technique and technology, then they are controllable. They're perfectible. Things can be managed in a controllable way. Things can be controllable. And it seems that wilderness puts that under pressure, those predispositions. And Hartmut Rosa, is one of the great kind of critics of controllability, that our controllability as a disposition toward the world ends up producing more and more aggressive forms of uncontrollability. We control the atom and we produce the most devastating kinds of uncontrollability, and so on. Wilderness seems to, I think, in various theological traditions, mystical traditions, tends to draw one towards silence. It's possible to encounter wilderness and seek greater levels of control to control the situation. But the desert mothers and fathers point us instead toward silence, stillness, quieting yourself, releasing one's hands, one's control of things, or rather recognizing that your predisposition toward the controllability of the world is an illusion, a falsehood. Of course, the world is responsive to us and responsive to what we do, but is not controllable. And that one thing that does is teach us that, in fact, this division between wilderness and habitable space is itself somewhat of an illusion, as Chris was wonderfully pointing us to in his poem and earlier this morning, that in fact marking places in the world off as wilderness gives us the kind of illusion that everything else is controllable and usable and for our utility, when in fact wilderness runs through everything in some sense. The aliveness of the world and uncontrollability of the world. And there's something about silencing oneself in the wilderness that draws us toward a stillness. And what happens when one becomes still? It can potentially allow us to realize that in our situation of lostness, that God has already found us. God has given all things into being, including your very being here. And the movement towards silence in experiences of wilderness reorient oneself to the world, sort of release one's grasp on the world, reorient us toward it in a way that allows the world to show up differently. And I want to explore that a little bit more in the talk. As a sort of point of reference, I've been reading Martin Laird's, he has a trilogy of books, the first of which is called Into the Silent Land. If any of what I just said is interesting to you, start there and you can kind of work your way through the through the trilogy. Okay. And of course, we should say that the notion of wilderness is entirely relative to what kind of organism one is, and to how one is prepared for or oriented in the world. Ecologists have increasingly shown how each wilderness has an extraordinary integrity of its own, with a very delicate ecological balance that's full of life forms, a balance that often plays some kind of vital role in sustaining life on the planet generally. Kevin made some wonderful comments to this effect earlier today. And if we're talking about something social or spiritual or cultural, then of course we don't have all the same experiences in places. What for one person is a place of liberation and open potential can be a wasteland and a place of loss for someone else. And that's important for our topic today as this talk unfolds, because the wildernesses we're discussing are full of people and full of beauty and full of all manner of things. Just to say a little bit then about befriending wilderness. It's quite an evocative idea given everything I've just said. Expressing a particular kind of affection, a growing love for the world where one finds oneself and whatever fellow forms of life also inhabit it, But what kind of love is this befriending that's happening here? It's not a kind of appetitive epithumia, if I could use one of the Greek words for it. The Greeks had lots of words for love. I'm going to play with those a little bit here. In which befriending wilderness means treating it as a kind of standing reserve to be overcome, mastered, utilized, colonized, what have you. Indeed, I think it's wise to try to avoid romanticizing or heroicizing wilderness or narrating one's own processes of deconstructing or whatever wilderness stands for in ways that turn out to be a kind of identity project. The love of befriending, as I'm thinking of it here, is probably closer to eros, which is a perception of and love for the good qualities in others. Sometimes we think of eros in strictly sexual terms, but eros, as the Greeks understood it, is a love of the good in others. There are many contemporary theologians. Pseudo-Dionysius certainly did this, but Hans von Balthasar, Sarah Coakley, and others who say eros, the strongest form of eros, is directed toward God, the fullness of goodness, and all eros is, in one sense or another, a desire for the fullness of goodness that includes the sexual and everything else. Perhaps this befriending might have a touch of agape in it, a love that loves the being of others irrespective of their qualities. But friendship, befriending, or philia, to use that Greek term, is an embracing of particular others as others with some kind of affectionate reciprocity that allows others to be themselves and enter ongoing relationship with them. It denotes a certain attentiveness and attunement to what might, if we're speaking about wilderness, to what might initially seem as inhospitable, and recognizing what is alive in it, and enduring one's own transformations under the pressures of wilderness in a way that reorganizes one's relationship to it. In fact, befriending might be vital to the transformation processes themselves, insofar as wilderness experience might open one to a deeper love for the world and love of others in it, an amor mundi, to use Hannah Arendt's sense of the term. Wilderness has, as I've said, has a tendency to pull things out of one's hands and to demand a kind of non-reactive honesty about one's situation, one's own capacities, one's own manipulative dispositions toward the world, and to increasingly some kind of a transformative silence. And it might be a temporary silence, but some sort of transformative silence in one's situation, which I think in the befriending opens one to embracing one's own particular creatureliness in a way that perceives the givenness of the world and delights in it and cares for it as a contingent, precarious thing. And Arendt, since I've referenced her work, would disallow this becoming a kind of sentimental notion. Loving the world entails being intimately acquainted with its goodness and its evils, its beauty and its pains. Throughout our discussions today, we're talking about a particular kind of wilderness pertaining to the artistic life. which is experienced within the spiritual, religious, social, cultural, political ecologies of contemporary art and contemporary art world. And it's that I want to address the rest of my comments to. And I want to try to address this topic by better understanding how and why this terrain might feel inhospitable to some, and perform a rethinking of how this terrain might be befriended. And I'll focus especially, there were some comments earlier about religious artists or Christian artists in contemporary art. And it's specifically that religious dimension of contemporary art as wilderness that I want to think about with you. In doing so, I am going to draw from this book. It's a big book, if you haven't seen it yet. It's not as bad as it looks, actually. It's not so bad. It's half appendix and notes and so on. It's so beautiful, it reads really quickly. But it probably could use a little distillation, so I'll distill a bit, make it accessible in some ways. And if anything I say here is interesting to you, you can track down some different version of it in the book. And this book opens with this sentence: "The canonical histories of modern and contemporary art have been written largely without serious consideration of religion." End quote. This doesn't mean that religion has been absent from contemporary art or irrelevant to it. In fact, religious traditions, and we might say serious religious considerations, to play on that opening sentence, are woven throughout the art making of the past 2 centuries and throughout the socio-cultural systems in which those artworks circulate. But for various reasons, religion became inaccessible or uninteresting in serious historical and critical considerations of this art making. So that when one turns to the scholarship about these periods, one finds religion playing little or no constructive role in the writing about this art or the teaching about this art, for those of you who have gone through an MFA program or something like that. And this leaves major aspects of 20th and 21st century art extremely underinterpreted, but it also creates zones of stifled thinking and stifled speech around these aspects, marked by awkwardness, thinness, or even mutual unintelligibility. Just not sure what's going on there. This hasn't gone unnoticed by art historians. There are several influential scholars who've acknowledged it over the years but have struggled to address it. Most directly, James Elkins published a short book on the strange place of religion in contemporary art in 2004. I read that book sometime around 2007 when we were inviting Elkins here and had a conversation that was really, it set me on a path that has produced this book several years later. And Jim ended up being such a wonderful conversation partner here. The strangeness Elkins refers to is that religious concerns and conceptualities are quite frequently in play in contemporary art, but the methods, theories, and narratives that have structured the grain of the history of modernism, as he calls it, have rendered this content mostly uninterpretable and irrelevant to what makes contemporary art contemporary. Religion might have a place in contemporary art, writes Elkins, but it does not have a place in talk about contemporary art. Things have been changing quite a bit since he published that sentence, but there remains a major need for non-reductive or at least sufficiently thicker understandings of how and why that has been the case. Elkins gave us some signposts about why that has been the case, but I'm going to go further, I think, in trying to understand why. If one spends much time shuttling between artist studios, galleries, art libraries, and departments of art history, one soon encounters precisely this strangeness. Many prominent artists are thinking about religion, spirituality, and theology, whether or not they consider themselves to be personally religious, and they're addressing these topics in widely varying ways. And you can have conversations with them in their studios about this. And one of the things that produced this book was having this kind of cognitive dissonance of, having all of these conversations with quite prominent artists in their studios. Yet, when one moves to the professional writing, speaking, and teaching about those same artists, this aspect of their work receives only cursory thinking or simply disappears altogether as thinking gets channeled through more established critical patterns. An example of this from early in my own development was seeing a 2005 exhibition at the LA County Museum of Art by Tim Hawkinson. I was fresh out of my MFA program at that point, and I was teaching in my very first semester as an adjunct professor here at Biola when that show opened. And I take Tim's work to be an extended meditation on the physical and epistemic limits of human being and knowing within the flow of time. His work is a kind of meditation on time and being in time. And the work is playful. It's wonderfully playful and profound, I think. In fact, it's subtle but substantive in the way that religious points of reference are vital to how the work works. One of many, and we could talk about that show in the entire talk, but one of the many works in that show was his sprawling, noisy sculptural installation titled Pentecost from 1999, which consists of a giant tree form built out of ducting materials and concrete forms so that it's a hollow tree, and the various parts of the tree all have different diameters. Situated around that tree are 12 figures, each with a different mechanized body part that taps on the tree. And because the tree has all these different diameters, they have different pitches. They are tapping out Christmas carols. Those aren't terribly recognizable, but once one stills oneself, one can hear the Christmas carols being sung, tapped by these 12 bodies around this tree. It's titled Pentecost. It's not terribly immediately clear what to do with that title, although there are quite a few sign pointers for what to do with that title. What struck me was not only the power of this work and of his other work. I think Überorgan is his masterpiece of sorts, that it has the same conceptual and material structure as this in many ways, that is an organ playing cultural doxologies. But what struck me was not only the power of the work, but I read everything I could get my hands on related to this work. And there was never more than half a sentence devoted to the subject matter of the work, Pentecost. Usually something along the lines of, named after the event where the disciples spoke in tongues, or something like that. But what if you did something more with that, critically and interpretively? And that sort of set me off on it highlighted something for me, a certain dynamic that then got repeated over and over again in my experiences in contemporary art. And then it started happening down through modern art. It was retroactively. Wait a minute, I studied all of these artists, and we didn't talk about this aspect of their work. Those are the minor works or something like that. And this disconnect isn't simply the doing of scholars. Artists are cagey when it comes to speaking publicly about these topics, religious topics or spirituality. At least they used to be. They're warming up. Especially when they are themselves personally religious, which is the case for Hawkinson, for example, or more commonly when they have quite a conflicted, complicated relationship with religion, which is most everyone else I'm going to mention in this talk. This situation's been shifting. Over the past 20 years, there's been a remarkable increase in attention to religion, spirituality, theology, even in contemporary art, among artists and scholars alike. In the first instance, many artists are foregrounding and constructively addressing their own conflicted relationships with religious traditions. Jan Vo, for example, consistently repurposes Christian artifacts as a means of exploring his own family's Roman Catholicism, which is rooted in Vietnam and complicated by his family's refugee relocation to Germany and then Denmark. Arthur Jafa is interested in the ways that online video platforms like YouTube operate as a kind of audio-visual unconscious, for him, especially in which Black American life becomes visible in deeply complicated ways. He powerfully explored this in his 7-minute video montage, Love is the Message and the Message is Death. He explored that idea of the kind of audiovisual unconscious of Black life, making Black life visible in ways that are incoherently violent and full of pathos and full of life and full of coercion and all sorts of things. So it's a very powerful but heartbreaking film in a lot of ways. And Jafa responded to this with A King Done Cometh As, which is a 140-minute series of long clips of sermons and gospel music rooted in American Black church. The entire thing is a sermon, more or less. And it's a sermon in which, threaded all the way through this film, is a sermon by T.D. Jakes. He shows up in 5 long clips in which he's preaching about the raising of Lazarus, which causes the entire montage to revolve around the impossible possibility of being raised from the dead within one's own life, a transformation so deep that it is a raising from the dead. And not only within one's life, which is what Jakes is preaching about, but within one's own history and social histories that include all sorts of appalling violence. I have 2 book chapters about that work. One is out, one is coming someday soon. Hopefully there's a book coming out that's called Arthur Jafa and Religion. Hopefully that comes out in a year or something, I don't know. But that's my best take on this, so you can look forward to that. Tacita Dean traces a generative but fraught relation to Christianity in ways that literally feature wilderness. Her Quarantania is a large 7-panel image, altered photograph, depicting the mountain in the Judean desert where Jesus was tempted by the devil. Dean has scrawled numerous barely legible phrases across the surface, as if kind of semiotically mapping the temptation narratives back onto the geography. Some of these scrawlings emphasize features of the landscape, like marking a fault line in the rocks or a cave and so on. But many of them evocatively engage the biblical text, focusing especially on the third temptation, the desire for power, as is written at the top center of the image, which appears in loose cursive lettering right near the cropped top of the mountain, alongside the presumably demonic provocation for higher, higher, more, more, which is also written up there. It's a visual textual summons into the Palestinian desert, which is located in the West Bank, a conflicted wilderness indeed, or place, not wilderness, in a way that pivots on and raises questions about the particular logic of Jesus' renunciation of power and resistance of that temptation. In the discourse of 20th and 21st century art, such imagery is sometimes recognized, but generally left uninterpreted, which is also the case with Dean's work. And of course, it's certainly not only Christian traditions that are becoming more visible. Hussein Valamanesh, for example, had an extended, quite sensitive dialogue with Sufi theology that was also internally conflicted in really interesting ways, as does Monir Farmayan, and so on. Many, many more artists could be mentioned here. And if you're interested, chapter 3 of the book is full of examples. Chapter 3 is in some ways a provocation. This could be studied, this could be studied, this could be studied, this could be studied. It's like resourcing the field. Like, take any of these and write an article about it. Shifting our attention to scholars, if those are artists, a kind of random sampling, this renewed attention tends to be dispersed across radically different interpretive priorities, this new talk about religion, spirituality. And it often lacks a sustained interdisciplinary dialogue that holds up well both as scholarship of art and scholarship of religion. And that presents a second major need for non-reductive understandings of what's happening here. Much of my current work is trying to better understand the dynamics shaping this situation and adjust them, offering a kind of detailed rethinking of the contexts in which current discussions about religion and spirituality and contemporary art are happening, and an argument for why and how these discussions require more concentrated study, both critical and constructive study, of the often implicit theologies in play in the history, theory, and criticism of art. I should say, in arguing that the histories of the written histories of 20th and 21st century art have significantly underinterpreted their own religious and theological dimensions, I'm not claiming that modernism and its contemporary lineages actually turn out to be a kind of religious cipher or crypto-Christian art, if you just look at them right. Rather, I'm claiming that those lineages did not simply leave religion behind, nor did they fall theologically mute, nor have the relations between them been simply or simplistically oppositional and antagonistic. The relations are more complicated and more interesting than that. That's the argument. And they stand to be understood as such and engaged as such, with as much subtlety and rigor as we engage the political, social dimensions of contemporary art, for example. And this complicated and more interesting relation often has much more to do with deep conflictedness than with sheer unbelief or spiritual desuetude. I love that word so much, but no one knows what it means anymore. So it's like it's obsolescence. It doesn't work anymore. Outmoded. Desuetude. It has to do with deep conflictedness, not just sheer unbelief. If contemporary art sometimes feels like a spiritual wilderness, it's one in which there is a great deal of life and care, and in which there are very significant and transformative things happening. And it's in that respect that I want to explore today. So I want to do a couple things in the time remaining. I was given quite a bit of time to talk, by the way, so sorry. Buckle. Make yourselves comfortable. First, I want to address those two needs that I already mentioned in passing, which I'll reframe as questions. First, how and why has the scholarship of modern and contemporary art history generally misperceived the ways its own histories are shaped by and engaged with religion? I know religion is a problematic term. I'm going to use it heuristically here. That's fine. We can argue about what religion means later and whether it's an appropriate term at all. It's not, but we'll use it. To the extent, how have these histories misperceived the ways they are shaped by religion, to the extent that religion becomes generally invisible and undiscussable in that scholarship, or did become undiscussable. Again, it's changing. Which brings us to our second question. How and in what ways can we understand the renewed visibility and discussability of religion in contemporary art that is happening constantly these days? Yesterday, I visited the show called Speaking in Tongues at the Institute for Contemporary Art in LA. And that is one of many such shows that is going on right now. And then third, I want to turn to a case study briefly that is drawn from the book, from chapter 5 of the book, to explore what kinds of writing and thinking become possible, which is where all of this sort of eventually goes to, is like, okay, fine, even if we've underinterpreted religion and we're kind of doing so in an ad hoc way now, well, what then? What does writing actually look like? What is possible that would be compelling and actually a contribution to the practice of art history? Okay, so that's our game plan. We'll move through each of those relatively quickly. There are many places to study and this is the first. There are many places to study the problems of writing about religion in 20th century art. One of the most evocative is in the pages of October, at least for me, the highly influential Journal of Art Theory and Criticism that was founded in 1976. My initial journeys into October, perhaps like yours, were something like venturing into a desert. I experienced it initially as a place of refusal and depletion, a place overheated under the lights of the seminar room and ice cold once it became dark, so to speak. But once I let myself become quiet and really listen, and that took a while, I increasingly began to hear something deeply significant in those pages. There are many places to go for this, but I'll focus in the book on Rosalind Krauss's influential essay, Grids, which was published in 1979. Krauss's aim was to understand why the grid had such preeminence in 20th century art. Why was it so eminently fitting, compelling, and emblematic of modernism throughout the century? And she offers this explanation early in the essay. Given the absolute rift that had opened between the sacred and the secular, the modern artist was obviously faced with the necessity to choose between one mode of expression and the other. The curious testimony offered by the grid is that at this juncture, he tried to decide for both. Those two options being the sacred and the secular. Deciding for both was possible, Krauss argues, because of an irresolvable ambivalence in the grid. On the one hand, the grid enacts, in her words, a naked and determined materialism by mapping the surface onto itself in a way that collapses any representational metaphysics. So it is pure material painting, no representation, thus no metaphysics, representational metaphysics. a desert in some sense. On the other hand, even the simplest grid is suggestive of infinity and immutability, as the very principle of a grid has no center and no end. The grid might even be said to enact a dematerialization of the surface, as Krauss says. So you have these conflicting readings of the logics built into the grid, that it is simultaneously a pure and determined materialism and a dematerializing way of speaking about the infinite and the immutable. And it is ambiguously both. And Krauss continues, in the increasingly desacralized space of the 19th century, art had become the refuge for religious emotion. It became, as it has remained, a secular form of belief. Although this condition could be discussed openly in the late 19th century, it is something that is inadmissible in the 20th, so that by now we find it indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spirit in the same sentence. The peculiar power of the grid, its extraordinarily long life in the specialized space of modern art, arises from its potential to preside over this shame, to mask and to reveal it at one and the same time, which thereby allows a contradiction between the values of science and those of spiritualism to maintain themselves within the consciousness of modernism, or rather, its unconscious as something repressed. Those are amazing sentences. I have an appreciative but highly critical reading of Krauss's article in chapter 1. You can see more about that, in which I'm calling into question her assumptions here, her terminology, and subjecting her argument to many counterexamples that are also appearing in and around 1979. She's telling a highly overdetermined secularization story here, which is a story that is governing what she deems admissible, for instance. But her essay is also highly insightful because it shows at quite a deep level and in the concrete ubiquitous form of the grid, one way in which spiritual struggle has operated invisibly in 20th century art as something repressed. So you can have a purely materialist conversation in public and have a kind of spiritual release in private. And she's arguing artists are doing both of these things. This is illegitimate. This is legitimate for real scholarship, real art criticism. And so the contradiction operates in the whole history of modernism as something repressed. I'm very interested in that idea. We'll leave Krauss for sake of time, but there's much more to say about all of that. Leaping forward 25 years, Krauss and 3 other leading editors of October published Art Since 1900, which is a massive text, something like this, 2 volumes, that powerfully formulates a history of 20th century art in which religion is almost entirely absent and irrelevant, which is striking because the authors are social art historians, and they bring seemingly every other social context into view. I mean, it is a stunning work. If you go through the index, for instance, there is reference to every possible domain of culture except religion. There are no serious religious thinkers that appear in the book, other than Meister Eckhart, who's quoted in the Dada chapter, very interestingly. I mean, that's exactly right. That's what Dada was doing, at least a good portion of it. But no one from the 20th century, not even they could have quoted Martin Luther King under different auspices, but no. Nor any religious texts and so on. It's just kind of invisible. But 2004 also marks a significant shift in this kind of invisibility becoming conspicuous, which might be exemplified in Elkin's book, but not only there. There are several other publications that I'll point to here in a bit. As I see it, there are three main dynamics that have rendered religion unintelligible in the histories of 20th century art. And this is kind of reworking Elkin's, I think, drawing out some of his observations, but reworking them so that they, I think, hold differently, maybe better. So I'll just kind of name these briefly. Elkins notes how modernist art involved a deterioration of religious themes, and that goes in quotes, such that religion became interpretively ambiguous. Modernism saw the development of highly self-reflexive forms, including like non-objective painting, conceptual ways of working, and so on, that often eschewed traditional iconographies, and it flourished generally without any religious patronage. So nothing is intended for churches. We're not having religious iconography, such that religion just became less visible. This is a factor, but it actually doesn't explain very much, I don't think. Elkins emphasizes it, but I just don't think it's all that important. It's relevant, but it's not that important. In truth, and for a couple reasons. For one, religious imagery actually does occur quite frequently in 20th century art. It just does so in the minor works. You have to kind of go a little bit offline to see what all of the major modernists were doing with religious imageries. Not all, but several. And that wouldn't be decisive anyway, because like our highly sophisticated attention to political power in modern art, for example, is not at all limited to identifying political themes or political iconographies or political patronage in order for us to understand the ways that they are profoundly political in the ways that they organize relationships between people. So there's deeper things going on. Like, we just lack that kind of subtlety in attending to the theological dimensions of artworks, for instance. We need, like, religious themes to hang that on, otherwise it's irrelevant. So I think there's something else going on, something more. Secondly, and I've already touched on this, in general, modernist art histories were written with an especially rigid secularization theory built into them, such that religion became interpretively implausible. In many tellings of 20th century art, both from secularist positions and religious positions. I mean, there are all sorts of religious art historians, Christian art historians, who tell the same secularization story. It's just a tragedy, but they mirror each other. This is why I responded to Rookmacher. Rookmacher tells a secularization story that is every bit as rigid as Krauss's. He regards it as a disaster. Okay. So in many tellings, modernism simply is, by definition, a highly potent enactment and exemplification of secularization at the fundamental level of visibility itself, or visuality itself. Religion is exactly what the history of modern and contemporary art cannot be about. So when it does show if this theory is built into the way that you're narrating art, this just can't be what modern art is about. So when it does show up, say in an artist's minor works, it could only be vestigial, ironic, or critical. And the authors of art since 1900 have been pretty straightforward about this. Benjamin Buchloh says in 2001, the liberation of the work of art from ritual and cult was the key question of the 20th century, end quote. Or Evelyn Bois, another of the authors of that volume, Quote, "The secularization of Western art, despite regular paeans to spirituality from dealers and hack critics, etc., the secularization of Western art seems nearly perfected." The perfected signals that it's a project. It's not descriptive, it's agenda. And this highly overdetermined version of secularization theory has proven itself to be very problematic. It's more of a political program than a philosophically or sociologically compelling analysis of what has actually happened. Something has happened, but whatever secularization means, it does not mean the disappearance of religion or belief. It seems to have more to do with pluralization of belief and disaffiliation from previous social formations. But disaffiliation and the scrambling of categories that results from that does not mean the breakdown of belief or spirituality or religion. It just means change. And some of what has been breaking down and disaffiliated from could use some breakdown and disaffiliation. Okay. And none of this halts theological questioning anyway, but pressurizes it and probably amplifies it, creating new conditions for questioning and new conditions for belief. And that's, I'm happy to say that modern and contemporary art is a deeply secular art form, but secular meaning not an elimination of all forms of religion and belief, as though you have just this kind of subtraction model of a secularization theory, but that you have belief under pressure, belief that has been fragilized. And not in the sense that it becomes fragile, but that one can only hold one's belief while looking over one's shoulder at every other thing on option, that sort of thing. That's a different context. And so you have modern and contemporary art that is an art of struggle, of belief, of conflict, inner conflict. But that can be theologically very important and very interesting, not just blank. Okay. Third, I think there's a further factor that comes from modernist critical theory that was developed in tandem with art history, that has operated with an especially strong hermeneutics of suspicion, especially in the second half of the 20th century. Such that religion becomes interpretively reducible to other explanations. So in their various forms of critical theory, Marxian, psychoanalytic, structuralist, and so on, all the various complexities of religion can be seen to be really the operations of structural power, symptoms of sublimated desire, and so on. So even where there is religion conspicuously in play and on view in modern and contemporary art, it is mostly masking coercive power dynamics. And so you attend to those, dismantle and critique the power dynamics, and move forward. But the religion that might be in play is precisely what gets dismantled and regarded suspiciously. Does that make some sense? You put these three together, and you have a pretty compelling understanding of why religion just wasn't part of any intelligent conversation in the writing and teaching of 20th century art. Okay, we'll talk. I'm happy to take questions about that at the end or right now. If any of you have a burning question, I'm happy to field that now. Actually, that's because this is sort of a pivot in the talk. Okay, yeah, sure.
Strikes me as interesting is that seems to happen from the critics, but then also in art institutions, young MFA students coming up and have their teachers saying, well, this is just how you do art, and it
Yeah.
seems to strip it
Yeah.
from that perspective as well.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, if I get your question, it's sort of, I mean, sometimes this is overtly discussed in art schools. There are, like, Rosalind Krauss says it's indescribably embarrassing to mention art and spirit in the same sentence. Sometimes that shame was enforced. There is sometimes overt shaming about using those words. But more often than not, it's just a culture of how one talks sensibly talks well about modern and contemporary art. And that culture becomes kind of self-extending or amplifying or something. That's just how you get good at being a professional talker about contemporary art, is to talk about power or whatever it is, sublimated desire, but not that. Or if you're going to do it, as we'll talk about a little bit later, it has to be kind of brought up into that larger critical apparatus. So like, I'll mention spiritualities, like animistic spiritualities, because they are dismantling and challenging colonial power structures. So in some sense, that can be sort of brought up into it. Is that speaking to your question, like with the kind of extension teaching, I mean, you just learn to think in a certain way. And sometimes sometimes it takes some kind of a wilderness, a silencing of oneself to like start to wonder about how the pieces of that culture are operating, what they're doing really well and what they're leaving out. I should say, like when I mention the critique of structural power, that's all great. I mean, that actually needs to happen, needs to continue. I'm not critiquing that. I'm just saying that there are mechanisms in that way of speaking about art that make other things invisible and undiscussable. And one of those things is like not just religion as social construct, but the spiritual theological questioning that's in play in religion. Is that okay?
Young people coming up thinking about what they're making and how that's going to influence what they
Yeah.
end up making.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, good. Very good. Maybe one more question if you have one. If not, we can go on, but just... Okay.
How would it work that after just these like Dali's
Yeah.
the red is these
Well, yeah. I mean...
or one
Yeah. I mean, with those... to the extent that there is quite a rigid secularization theory in place, kind of at the heart, like what is modernity? Modernity is the kind of the social dynamics that have eroded any basis for shared religious or even rational religious belief. Okay, so if that's true, then Dali starts painting a crucifixion based on John of the Cross, St. John of the Cross. So what's that about? Well, I mean, it's either a kind of delusion or whatever. It's kind of an artifact of an earlier history. Maybe it's a kind of critical commentary in the way that he's bringing St. John of the Cross into, it's sort of a reception history of sorts in 20th century. So maybe it's some of those things. It can't be like what makes the work modern or contemporary. Like the crucifix part can't be, like that's not modern. Like that's not what makes the art interesting. So what makes it interesting? There is some kind of a fantasy, an unconscious, a sublimate, all sorts of sort of drama of sublimated desire at work throughout Dali's career work. And this is one more example of the unconscious energy sort of like manifesting itself in this kind of hallucinatory Catholicism or something like that. So you could go that way, a kind of like psychoanalytic route. You could go a kind of a more like anthropological, like this is a Spanish painter receiving a Spanish history and a Spanish visual culture and sort of projecting it in a way that becomes kind of a commentary on the hold that visuality, visual culture has on a people group, something like that. You know what I mean? Those are some off the top of my head, and there would be other ways to kind of go about it. Yeah. But you see, in each of those examples, just that sort of sketch I gave, it takes apart. And I'm happy to entertain all of those ways, like in what we'll do here. I'm happy to entertain all of that and actually go further with each of those. Like I'm quite interested in each of those readings. But if that operates in a way that we never actually talk in any substantive way about John of the Cross in relation to Dali's painting, or even what Dali was saying about Catholicism at the time and his Catholic conversion, which is wild and somehow tied up in like Franco-fascism and like it's complicated, but if we make inaccessible all speech that would take the painting theologically serious as one of its dimensions, then we're just not doing great art criticism. Because that's part of what the work is. And so, yeah, okay. Okay, we'll move on. Maybe that will become even increasingly clear. Over the past 2 decades or so, there's been a significant surge in interest in religion, spirituality, theology, and contemporary art, as I've already mentioned, partially due to a general unraveling of old secularization theories in the humanities and a deepening concern or an exhaustion or a malaise about the kinds of reading and scholarly dispositions that the hermeneutics of suspicion has produced. And lots of people are talking about this. Rita Felsky is really helpful on this in the book, The Limits of Critique. But even the authors of Art Since 1900 say this, like Hal Foster says, all of these critical, like suspicious models have run into the sand, as he says. Okay. Because suspicion is great in a lot of ways. It allows us to read structural dynamics that are going on behind the surface of artworks and within institutions showing artworks and all of that. Suspicious modes of reading are great and very productive. But once they become total, they start to totalize our critical response to artworks and to others, we find ourselves kind of only making suspicious movements and have no resources for accounting for love or care or joy or so on. And it makes us really mean to each other. I'm not blaming our political situations on the hermeneutics of suspicion, but Once everyone imbibed it, left, right, center, everyone, then it's like a suspicion all the way down, all day, every day, on Twitter and everywhere else. And again, there's a really profound need for suspicion these days. I'm as suspicious as anyone about politics. But we need other modes of reading as well. And as I've already indicated, religion is becoming both more visible and more discussable. In addition to the artists I've already mentioned, here's two more, just for fun, and to make this talk longer, evidently. Andrea Büttner is an artist I'm really interested in, German artist who does all of these collaborations with communities of nuns in all sorts of different ways. Her work is about a kind of extended meditation on monastic littleness that she draws from the Saint Therese of Lisieux, the French saint from the early 20th century, who had this theology of littleness, the little way. And Büttner puts that theology of littleness directly into contact with the things that seem to overpower it, like the context of spectacle. So she has a video of these nuns like living and working in an amusement park. It's a wonderful film. Or living and working right next to the Dachau concentration camp, a kind of appalling history that is unmendable, that sort of thing. She's interested in voluntary notions of voluntary poverty in relation to Carmelite and Franciscan communities and so on. This is the one with the nuns in the amusement park. Or Genesis Tremaine, we could point to, who's a African-American artist who considers herself a devotional painter. And they are portraits, but they are portraits that are based on her own transformative experience of seeing, really having a kind of vision of, in which she saw, in her words, she saw herself, and she saw all of them, and she saw all of you. And that is what the paintings are. They are eyes and faces within faces. And they're like, there was a real controversy recently behind closed doors because her, I don't think it was one of these paintings, but one of her paintings was, or actually I think 3 of them were acquired by the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and as they were kind of processing them, her materials list is acrylic, oil stick, oil pastel, Lori's seasoned salt, and the Holy Spirit on canvas. And they're like, well, we don't really have, we can't really register Holy Spirit as a material. That doesn't work in our system. And she said, then you can't have the paintings. And so they figured out a way to register the Holy Spirit. Anyway, there's something going on, something quite profound in Büttner, in Tremaine, and others. And these are not like marginal artists. These are artists who have quite a visibility. Pertaining to discussability, there's numerous books, articles, exhibitions now available on this subject from a range of perspectives. Here's a sampling starting from 2004 after Elkins. This is just a sampling. I've got lots of these. I'm especially interested in the exhibitions because of the ways they engage questions of both visibility in the museum and discussability in wall text, catalog, essays, programming, and so on. This became such an interest of mine that I compiled a pretty comprehensive list of all such exhibitions over the past 100 years. That's why I say the book isn't so bad, because like a good 100 pages of it or so is this appendix. And then I put all of it in extended form on my website. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. Here's a handful, 100 Artists See God, which I also saw early in my own development here. Seeing God, the first Singapore Biennale was called Belief, and it just sort of goes, and there's lots and lots of these from all different perspectives. However, this resurgent conversation is often confusing and underdeveloped, as I've already alluded to. So how might we better understand and even kind of map this resurgence? Not to make it tidy or to systematize it, but to better understand what's happening with an appropriate degree of complexity, enabling one to orient or reorient oneself within it. And there's much to be said here. Chapter 4 of my book and 5 try to perform this kind of mapping. I'm going to skip most of that, but only say one kind of set of categories that's been helpful for me in thinking about this. And this will kind of lead us straight into that last case study. So there is an end in sight here. Because we could go through like all different ways of seeing artworks, what to pay attention to, that sort of thing. But they don't really tell us how to they don't account for what I take to be very different hermeneutical fields of vision in which the current conversation between art and religion is showing up as salient and intelligible and full of implication. So I think it's important to try to push the sort of discussion about religion in contemporary art further into the central questions it's asking. And that's what I want to try to do here briefly. And I've used the term hermeneutical horizons. I know that's jargony. But it's what I'm after here is I want to try to identify the questions currently organizing the study of religion in contemporary art. Not just the study, the talk about it, the speech about it. I borrow the term horizon from Gadamer, if that means anything to you. They're not methods. These are not methods. They're not approaches. They're not disciplines, anything like that. They're different ways. I'm trying to name different ways that when we're speaking about religion in art, different ways that we orient our most basic questions and concerns. Even our sense of world is in play here. So horizon isn't just about a distance, something out on the horizon. I'm more interested in horizon as a kind of encircling domain in which something shows up to you as related to some kind of a larger world and larger field of questions. That's what I mean by horizon. And I formulated these, 4 of them, simply by just reading everything I could get my hands on over the course of about 17 years and trying to carefully listen to the concerns that various writers were bringing to this topic or nexus of topics. What kind of intelligibility are they trying to produce? And I saw 4 horizons consistently reappearing, and so I've named them these as a sort of attempt to identify what they are. And these are not disciplines. They're named like anthropological horizon is not anthropology. It's a kind of trying to identify some way in which the meaning of artworks is important or salient or whatever. Okay, enough throat clearing. Seen within an anthropological horizon, the questions of art and religion are principally concerned with what these reveal about cultural formations. Contemporary art and religion must be studied together because of what their interrelations tell us about how particular social worlds are formed and sustained. You can't just leave religion out of social art history. It's part of what makes society what it is. And so it has to be incorporated purely for anthropological reasons, if no other reason, to do better justice to the kind of social worlds that make modern and contemporary art work and do what it does. Some of the main terminologies here of people working in this horizon, as I see it, are material culture, social identity, social memory, religious imagination, and so on. So the Catholic Imagination by Eleanor Hartney, for instance, is basically like, hey, all of these contemporary artists were getting in trouble in the culture wars in the 80s. We're still doing culture wars, but 80s and 90s. They were all raised in Catholic households. What does that tell us about the controversies? So she's trying to do justice to that. She says, I was raised Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a believer. But it still haunts me. It still shapes the way that I think. And it probably does to these artists. And then so on. You could do something similar with Jewish identity or material culture or so on. The exhibition, The Problem of God, takes a really similar approach in which the curator framed the whole thing around the cultural afterlife of Christianity. She kept going to artist studios, and they were all using Christian imageries. Why? It seems to be something about cultural afterlife. It keeps banging around in our heads, and let's make a show about it. Okay. But the horizon of questioning was primarily anthropological. The problem of God is, of course, a theological problem as well, but that was not really part of the conversation, and that's okay. But just to sort of name the kind of encircling horizon for the show. Seen within a political horizon, the question of art and religion are principally concerned with the organization and operation of power in a society. Here, the renewed interest in religion may have nothing to do with faith or belief, but with religion's potential to provide critical positions, resources, or focal points for resistance and critique of structural power as it operates at the level of visibility. That was a mouthful, but what that means, here are some examples of works that kind of fit here. Of particular interest is Donald Preziosi's book, Art, Religion, Amnesia. Donald Preziosi is a very famous art historian from UCLA who came out with this book, Art, Religion, Amnesia, in which he says, look, all art is implicitly needs a religious metaphysics to work at all. And religion needs artifice to work at all. And these two are, as he says, parallaxically entwined. And so we have to critique. We can't critique art or religion without critiquing both at the same time. And for him, that's a political project that is, because it's about the operations of coercive power in a society. But that is bringing religion into the conversation very much as within a political horizon. And there's really interesting work being done here. It tends to not have any theological intelligence to it. That sounded too bad. But that's not what it's interested in. The question of God is not the interesting question. The question of power is the interesting question. Here's another artwork example. In Frankfurt, it's called the Divine Comedy, in which it takes Dante's Divine Comedy and reverses it. So the show proceeds from paradise to purgatory to inferno. And it is all a deconstruction of the entire notion of ascending to paradise, because that is all sort of built on an inferno on earth, and paradise as a kind of conceptual release valve for oppressive social systems, that kind of thing. That's all very interesting, but it's operating within a particular horizon. Within a spiritual horizon, the questions of art and religion are principally concerned with fostering socio-eco-spiritual healing, awakening, connectedness, or re-enchantment amid the disconnective and disenchanting conditions of modernity. Political concerns are often incorporated here, but they're seen as grounded in deeper spiritual crises that cannot be addressed through political struggle or critique without some kind of more comprehensive spiritual awakening and transformation. This is becoming increasingly sort of obvious. We don't fix our political problems politically. There's something else going on with us. Within this horizon, the arts might be especially capable of catalyzing such healing in societies that are both post-religious and post-secular. So this spiritual horizon tends to be both of those things. And here, art is seen as reappropriating social concepts and practices from various traditions while detaching them from traditional orthodoxies, institutions, and norms. So this is tends to be a sort of spiritual, not religious. What am I doing? Here we go. So kind of key terms within this horizon are the spiritual, with the definite article. That tends to be a kind of key term. The spiritual or re-enchantment, those sorts of dialogues. And again, there's a lot of really beautiful things going on within this kind of writing. Lastly, within a theological horizon, the questions of art and religion, the argument goes, can't really be addressed without attending to the complex but often implicit theologies in play throughout art history. Theologies which, of course, are not reducible to artists' conscious intentions or the institutions they're working for, any more than an artist or an artwork's politics can be reduced to an artist's conscious intentions. A wide variety of approaches are possible here, but common among them is that the world's being in relation to God remains a live question. And the manifold histories of talking about God in relation or non-relation to world are still live in the discourse of modern and contemporary art. So the inquiries involved here may or may not have any doctrinal commitments or clear doctrinal commitments, but they're attentive to the ways that artworks are at some level concerned with theological ontologies, anthropologies, ethics, eschatologies, and more generally the world's being toward God. And that remains an open question, not necessarily decided. And there's lots of really interesting work along these lines in the last 20 years or so, from all different directions. James Herbert, who works not far from here, UC Irvine, wrote a book called Our Distance from God, in which he's saying modern contemporary art is always sort of negotiating this business of distance, placing oneself in the world in relation to other. And that distance is in itself theologically charged in what mediates distance in a way that there's a loving regard for the other. What mediates that? For him, that's a theological question at some level. And so on. A really interesting exhibition, as an example here, is Fragments of a Crucifixion from Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago that I had the pleasure of seeing with Taylor, which was a very interesting exhibition about mostly racism experienced or worked through the visual language of crucifixion But the writing surrounding the exhibition had very live theological questions in it. In fact, the main author in the exhibition catalog is a theologian. Anyway, okay, you get the idea? I won't belabor the point, and we'll move to doing one last thing here. I do want to say, though, that my aim in differentiating these horizons from each other is not to artificially isolate them from each other, but to argue that each of the central questions being asked has an integrity to it that's irreducible to the others. That's the point. So that the spiritual can't simply be reduced to the political, and so on. It has an integrity to its own. And this irreducibility means that each horizon has a kind of encompassing quality to it, which generates powerful temptations to reduce all the other questions and all dynamics of contemporary art and religion to itself. And these reductions are a main reason why the conversation about religion and contemporary art has been so confusing, is because they're all talking past each other because other people's questions ultimately are reducible to the question I'm asking. Power, spirit, whatever. Secondly, even if they each have an integrity, these four horizons are obviously not mutually exclusive, insofar as the complexities of human life are simultaneously social, political, spiritual, and theological, so too artworks are potentially meaningful in all of these ways. So I'm interested in having multiple horizons in view, multiple questions that are irreducible to the others. They're not isolated from each other, but they're not reducible. And I think excellent sort of critics can have multiple horizons in view or switch between them, but we have to be alert to this fact that we all do find one of these to be most fundamental. That's that impulse toward reduction that I kind of want to resist. Not entirely resist, but resist. So that critics or scholars working in one of these horizons has tendency to caricaturize, misunderstand, or ignore those working in another. Of the four, I think the theological horizon is least developed within advanced studies of art, and it's the one that I'm thus particularly interested in developing. As a discipline, art history has extensively de-theologized its own subject matter, not only in modern art, but across centuries and geographies. You can take entire classes on Northern Renaissance art or Byzantine art, for instance, and not speak in any theologically serious way about the artworks you study. Of course, you have to be able to identify saints and figures, understand complex iconographical patterns. You need to know the biblical themes that are involved. You need to understand the religious contexts and genealogies of ideas and all of those sorts of things. But none of that entails understanding how the works work theologically, as theological reasoning, any more than studying political iconographies and so on helps you understand how artworks work politically. Okay. And I should say, conversely, theology has often neglected and disowned sometimes its own visual spatial intelligence and thus further de-theologized art history. They just don't pay attention to it as important for historical theology. So I'm interested in kind of rethinking that in both directions. Okay. Well, should we do a little bit with this, or should we take questions? I mean, we got like 15 minutes. I mean, this is the kind of so what, isn't it? All right, I'll do a little bit with this, and then we'll take some questions. This I use as a case study in chapter 5 of my book, and I'll just give you a brief taste of that here, in which it's trying to kind of open up a sort of different ways of writing. This is called Altar by Chris Martin, or Chris Martin if we anglicize it, which is fine to do here, I think. It's a full-scale steel model of the frame of the renowned Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck, or just Jan van Eyck. I won't enter into that debate here. The Van Eyck's really lush painterly detail and iconographies span across many panels and comprise really a meditation on God reconciling all things to himself. That's, I think, what the altarpiece is in a nutshell. By contrast, Martin gives us only a steel version of the vacant frame, which he only ever installs in outdoor contexts, never inside a museum. It was first installed here in Belgium on the coast of the North Sea, and it subsequently has been installed in several other locations, including densely metropolitan areas, such as here on the High Line in New York City, or in quite rural settings like here in Neuss, Germany, outside the Langen Foundation, and in sites directly connected to ecclesial spaces like here in London, outside of St. Botolph without Bishopsgate, and so on. It was even installed in front of St. Bavo's Cathedral, which is where the Ghent altarpiece is. It's directly in dialogue with them. And this multiplicity of environments means that widely varying visions appear through the framework: sea and city, public space, private, economy and ecology, institutions of art and church, and so on. What exactly is Martin showing us here? In one sense, he presents a kind of artifact that has been passed down through 6 centuries, replete with social memories. He's not presenting the frame of the altarpiece as much as the framework, the thing seen through, the construction, the bare architecture of a kind of inherited visual grammar that's long supported a way of seeing and being in the world. We might say that altar is kind of a skeletal structure of the Ghent altarpiece's visual theological body. It constitutes the character and range of motion of the altarpiece, but without any musculature or vocabulary to articulate its joints. Altar is directly in dialogue with Christianity, but how do we understand the character and implications of this dialogue? And this is where I then kind of think about the work within these 4 horizons. What if I keep all 4 of them open and see the work within each? For sake of time, I'll cut that short, but just to say that within an anthropological horizon, altar puts on display the shifting social worlds that have produced, surrounded, and supported the Ghenter framework over 6 centuries. The empty framework, in other words, is a kind of emblem, perhaps, of the historical emptying of the Christian imagination in Belgium. It's a grammatical framework that survives, but the content has sort of disappeared in the cross pressures of modernity. And so that it stands in the world as a kind of after image of a lingering European Christianity. It stands as an after image within the European social vision or social imagination. Or it depicts a kind of afterlife of Christianity. One way or another, it's the after that's the key. So that would be a way of reading it, kind of anthropologically. Of course, one can also read it as a All these social worlds that I've just mentioned are also densely political. Within a political horizon, Martin's presentation of this framework could be seen as an emblem of the powers of framing, of ordering a vision of the world, and thus subtly patterns of knowledge, desire, value, social relations, and so on. The ability to frame the vision of the eschaton is a profound power, for instance. And so one could go, and I, in the book, go for quite a ways with a kind of political, seeing this work within a political horizon, and that's quite productive. But it's not just political critique. It actually, like of the Ghent altarpiece, the political critique of the Ghent altarpiece actually turns around and I think starts critiquing the various structures surrounding the altar as political frameworks who are framing visions of the world. So in some sense, altar is critical in a sort of critical of things other than the Ghent altarpiece. Within a spiritual horizon, it might be argued that altar embodies a kind of spirituality that's both post-Christian and post-secular, borrowing the altering activity of the old framework, but cutting it free from the Christian tradition or institutions, reorienting its vision and its adoration and its hope toward the immediate environment, so that in some sense God the Father, Son, and Spirit is replaced by Mother Nature, Gaia, or something like that. But if Martin wanted a spirituality cut free from religion, it seems counterproductive to borrow such a recognizable and densely historical and theological framework. And so that pushes me into a theological horizon as well, within which this thing operates. And there are a couple different ways we might do that. I mean, one, we might note that the emptiness of the frame might have less to do with conceptual vacancy or social decay than visual silence. The polyptical time frame of the altarpiece is about the ontological relations between heaven and earth, the temporal relations between sources and fulfillment. The fact that the frame is presented without any imagery with which to think these relations doesn't eliminate or de-theologize those relations, but de-visualizes them. And theological traditions know what to do with de-visualization and silence. To put a kind of point on it, I don't see any good reason to interpret the vacancy of the frame through the intellectual heritages of Durkheim, Marx, or Nietzsche without also doing so through the lineages of Gregory of Nyssa, Pseudo-Dionysius, Nicholas of Cusa, and so on. But further, the work operates as a kind of aperture. What happens, and this seems to be Martin's interest, what happens if one sees the world through this framework as a still functional polyptical aperture? I mean, everything that appears in those cells is marked sort of semiotically by what is not shown there. So the adoration of the Lamb is, what one sees through it is always in some sense in the place of the adoration of the Lamb. And what does that do? I eventually get to arguing that the vision available in this kind of emptying, the vision available through the framework, is always one of chronological duress, of change, of fleetingness. Fleeting visions of the beauty and futility of all things under the sun. Time has always been passing in front of the Ghent altarpiece, but the emptiness of altar and its displacement into outdoor locations makes this more conspicuous than ever. as it constantly shows a moving image of the world, or shows some portion of the world as an image. One of the strangest aspects of this polyptical aperture, seeing through it, is that it momentarily flattens the spaces through the cells, causing the world to appear as a surface within the frame, a surface that moves and morphs, a surface that unfolds and enfolds, a surface that might be rolled up like a scroll. This experience of perceived flatness does not render the world unreal, but renders it delicate, limited, contingent. Nor does this perceived flatness detach the viewer from the surface. Rather, the surface seen through the open window of altar is the surface of all things, the intricate, replete, shining surface of the world as the surface to which all creatureliness belongs. My creatureliness, your creatureliness. In fact, the surface where all things finally shall come to pass, which is what the Ghent Altarpiece is about. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening to all of that.